Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. On a warm July morning in 1996, in a quiet community near Elkridge, Maryland, a 5-year-old girl wakes up in an empty house. Her mother is not in the bedroom, not in the kitchen, not in the driveway. Nancy Riggins' minivan is still parked outside. Her purse sits on the counter. The front door is unlocked. There are no signs of a break-in, no overturned furniture, no obvious struggle. In the master bedroom, the wedding ring she wore every day has been left behind. For investigators, this is the first picture they get of Nancy Lee Riggins, not from a family photograph, not from a 911 call, but from an absence that doesn't make sense. 37 years old. A working mother. Reliable. The kind of person who shows up to her shift, keeps appointments, and does not abandon a sleeping child without a car, money, or a word. When officers take those first notes, the details are simple and specific: one vehicle left at the residence, personal effects in place, young child unharmed, no immediate physical evidence of violence. It looks less like a planned departure and more like someone's life cut off mid-sentence. Her husband, Steve Riggins, tells police he came home from his night shift and found her gone. He waited. He assumed she needed space. Only when she didn't return did he involve law enforcement. On paper, it is a version of events that could fit a domestic argument, a cooling-off period, a spouse who walks out to make a point. But stacked against the scene in that house, the story starts to feel thin. Investigators are trained to weigh what people say against what the evidence allows. Here, the evidence is quiet, but it is not neutral. They document the unlocked door. They confirm the car remains at the property. They note the ring, the purse, the small child left with no adult present. They run standard checks, hospital admissions, traffic stops, immediate transactions. Nothing. No hits on her bank cards, no witnesses placing her on a bus, no indication she chose to disappear. In cases like this, patterns matter. Mothers leaving voluntarily almost always take something: a vehicle, cash, clothes, their child, or at least a phone call to someone. Nancy leaves nothing. This opening file does not prove a crime. It does something more subtle and more dangerous. It contradicts the idea that Nancy simply walked away. Detectives will spend years circling back to this morning, to this house, to this carefully ordinary scene that should not look like this if she is alive by choice. For now, the report reads missing person, but the questions on the page are already heavier than that label. Based only on this first snapshot, no body, no blood, no confession, do you believe Nancy Riggins left on her own, or are we looking at the first quiet frame of a homicide with no corpse? For detectives, the next step after that empty house is simple: find out who Nancy Lee Riggins is on paper, not in theory. They pull her employment records, attendance logs, banking activity, medical appointments. What they see is consistency. Nancy shows up. She works her shifts at the grocery store. She keeps her pediatrician visits for her daughter. Her checks clear. Her habits are predictable in the way real lives are predictable. There is nothing in her documented history that points to a woman about to vanish into thin air. They talk to the people who actually rely on her. Co-workers describe Nancy as steady, tired sometimes, but committed. She is not impulsive, not dramatic. Her family confirms the same picture. She is attached to her daughter, involved with her relatives, responsive to calls. The small things matter. She returns messages, she arranges childcare, she shows up when she says she will. When a person with that track record suddenly stops everything, no calls, no work, no paycheck activity, investigators treat that as data, not emotion. It is the first behavioral indicator that missing by choice is unlikely. They move to the days leading up to July 1st, phone contacts, conversations, and statements start to form a pattern. Several family members recall Nancy being under severe strain about her marriage. She had discovered something she should never have had to confront inside her own home: her husband's sexual involvement with the teenage babysitter who had been trusted around their child. She was upset, but not paralyzed. She told people she intended to separate. She talked about going to the authorities. Those statements are logged, dated, and later read back under oath. They are not gossip to the detectives, they are notice of risk. From an investigative point of view, this is where the file sharpens. A married woman with no history of disappearing, who has just expressed plans to expose a serious crime involving a minor, goes missing overnight. That chain is not speculation, it is the intersection of her own words and her sudden silence. In any jurisdiction, that combination would shift a missing person case toward a likely criminal investigation. In a quiet Maryland community in 1996, it sets off alarms. At the same time, the team is careful. They know audiences and juries are wary of narratives built only on "she would never." So they anchor every conclusion to records, time cards that stop, bank cards that go unused, no ticket purchases, no rental car, no shelter intake, no documented contact from Nancy with anyone after that date. They log the strain in her home as motive territory, not as proof. This is the disciplined part viewers sometimes overlook. Good detectives do not leap, they document and wait for the facts to support the direction of their instincts. There is another layer that makes this case matter beyond one family. When someone like Nancy disappears at the exact moment she is poised to challenge abuse and control inside her own house, it reflects a pattern seen in many domestic cases across the country. When victims move from silence to action, their risk often spikes. The Nancy file, even at this early stage, is a quiet warning. When a person says they are about to report, believe both their courage and their danger level. That awareness can save someone in a different house, in a different town, watching this now. By the end of this phase, investigators have no body, no physical crime scene, and no confession. But they do have a profile that is hard to argue with. Nancy Lee Riggins is a stable, accountable mother who has every reason to protect her child and every intention to confront serious wrongdoing. And then she is gone without a trace. That contradiction becomes the first solid brick in what will later be a nobody homicide case. When investigators start mapping the people inside Nancy Riggins' world, one name comes up again and again: the teenage babysitter. Not in rumor, not as a side note, but in statements, dates, and choices that now matter. She had been in the house for years in a role that sounds ordinary: help with the child, an extra set of hands when Nancy worked. On the record, it looks like trust. Off the record, by the summer of 1996, that trust is broken. Family members and friends tell detectives that Nancy had recently confronted the reality that the babysitter's relationship with her husband was not just inappropriate, it was criminal. She understood the age difference. She understood that this was not an affair between equals. And she was not keeping it quiet. Detectives document those conversations carefully. Multiple witnesses recall Nancy saying she wanted out of the marriage. More importantly, she was prepared to report what had been happening with the girl. For an investigator, that specific step, moving from personal betrayal to legal exposure, is a critical marker. It defines motive. If Nancy follows through, there is a risk of charges, public exposure, and the kind of permanent damage that reaches far beyond a divorce. The team sits down with the babysitter. This is where the case shifts from suspicion to structured evidence. In controlled interviews, with her age and vulnerability in mind, she describes a sexual relationship with Steve Riggins that began when she was underage. She confirms details that match what Nancy had told others she discovered. She places that conduct in the Riggins home, inside the same walls where Nancy was trying to keep a normal life running for her child. Those statements, corroborated and consistent, are entered into the file. They are no longer whispers. They are testimony. From that point, the internal dynamic in the Riggins home no longer looks like a private marital issue. On paper, investigators see a man facing potential criminal accountability and a woman positioned as a direct threat to his freedom. Nancy is not passive. She is not simply hurt. She is prepared to act. And then she vanishes. To keep the narrative honest for you, we stay close to verifiable facts. The evidence at this early stage is still circumstantial. There is no recovered body in 1996. No recorded confession. No forensic match tying anyone to a physical assault in that house. What exists is a converging line, a credible underage victim, a documented sexual relationship that will later lead to a conviction, and a wife who has clearly stated her intention to bring that information forward. The timing of her disappearance is not an accident on a calendar, it sits on top of those decisions. Detectives are trained to be cautious with stories that feel too neat. They test every piece. They confirm ages, cross-check timelines, verify who was where and when. They look at whether the babysitter has something to gain by what she is saying, whether her account matches independent evidence. The emerging pattern holds. She is not retrofitting a story to match headlines years later. This material surfaces as investigators are still trying to understand why Nancy would leave, or whether she ever had that choice. There is a human layer here that matters and does not require dramatics. Cases like this highlight how abuse, grooming, and control can operate in plain sight, inside homes that look typical from the outside. When a victim, whether a spouse or a minor, starts talking about going to law enforcement, that is often the most dangerous moment. If you hear someone in your own circle reaching that point, that is when support, documentation, and safety planning matter most. Nancy's case is not only an isolated tragedy, it is a caution light for similar patterns. At the start, Nancy is a missing person in a quiet Maryland community. Now, she is a key witness who intended to expose a felony, and then disappears. The babysitter is no longer a background figure, she is a corroborated victim whose account aligns with Nancy's warnings. The husband is no longer just the person who reported his wife missing, he is the one standing at the center of conduct that Nancy was about to bring into the open. Still no body. Still no formal murder charge. But the direction of travel is clear. From the moment Nancy Lee Riggins is entered into the system as a missing adult, the investigators in Howard County treat the file the way they are trained to handle a high-risk disappearance: start tight, move fast, and clear the obvious explanations before they harden into excuses. They go back through the morning scene with a sharper lens. Patrol officers had already confirmed no forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no visible signs of a break-in. That matters, but it is only the beginning. Now detectives document it formally: the unlocked door, the minivan in the driveway, the purse still in the home, the child asleep and uninjured. They take note of what is present and what is missing, the adult woman responsible for all of it. In many jurisdictions, this first pass can decide whether a case stalls or moves. In this one, they decide it moves. The early interviews focus on establishing a real timeline, not just a story. Employment records and witness statements confirm when Nancy was last reliably seen. Neighbors are asked about unusual cars, late-night noise, any sign of an argument. Workers at her job are asked about her last shifts. Friends and family are pressed on the last contact they had with her, and whether she mentioned leaving, hiding, or starting over somewhere else. The answers are consistent: no travel plan, no packed bags, no secret new life. On paper, no preparation for a disappearance. Then comes the part that often separates a genuine search from a box-checking exercise: they verify the reporting party. Detectives sit down with Paul Steve Riggins and walk through his version of events. He explains when he worked, when he left, when he came home, when he says he noticed Nancy was gone, and why he waited before calling authorities. That timeline is measured against employment logs, potential witnesses, and phone activity. Any gap is marked. Any change in phrasing is written down. In cases like this, the margin for coincidence is small. At this stage, the evidence is still non-physical, but the behavior patterns start to matter. Investigators are not looking for drama, they are looking for alignment. A spouse who is genuinely alarmed usually shows the same urgency in their calls, their questions, and their willingness to cooperate. A spouse who delays contact with law enforcement in the first critical window, especially when there is a young child left behind, moves into a different column on the board. It does not prove guilt. It does justify a closer look. Search efforts run in parallel. Ground teams and K-9 units check nearby woods, fields, routes she might have walked. Flyers go up. State and national databases are checked for any hit on her name, social security number, or vehicle, not just in Maryland, but across state lines. There is nothing. No use of credit cards. No request for medical help under her identity. No contact with the people she normally reached out to every week. The silence is complete, and in missing person work, complete silence from a stable adult with a child is itself a measurable data point. The file now holds more than a description and a last known address. It holds a contradiction, the picture of a woman who has every reason to stay engaged in her life, and the fact that she has abruptly vanished with no digital, financial, or personal trace. It also holds the outline of a household under pressure, a husband whose conduct with a teenager is under scrutiny, and a wife who has already told others she is ready to involve the law. When those threads intersect with a disappearance, experienced investigators do not treat that as background noise. There is a human responsibility woven into the way they work this kind of scene. One missing mother in a Maryland neighborhood is not just a statistic, she is a test of whether the system will respond early, correctly, and without bias toward the most convenient story. When adults vanish at the exact point where they are about to hold someone accountable, treating it like a voluntary walkout is not neutral, it is unsafe. Viewers who work in law enforcement, advocacy, or social services know this pattern well. On the record, Nancy Riggins is still listed as missing. Off the record, among the team actually reading the statements side by side, the question is no longer did she walk away, but who had something to lose if she stayed. That shift, from open field to focused suspicion, is the first major procedural turn in a nobody murder case. In the weeks after Nancy Lee Riggins disappears, the most useful evidence is not found in a lab. It is found in how people choose to live their lives when they believe no one is watching closely. Detectives keep the focus on that house in Howard County, on the man who reported his wife missing, and on what he does with the space she once filled. One of the first points that stands out on the timeline is the delay. Nancy is last verifiably seen on July 1, 1996. Her young daughter is found alone in the home. The initial missing person report is not made immediately. Investigators document this gap because, in a case involving a stable parent of a 5-year-old, those hours matter. A delay does not automatically equal guilt, but it is not ignored. It is entered into the record as a choice. What happens next turns that choice into a pattern. As officers continue checking leads, they are told that the teenage babysitter, the same girl at the center of Nancy's recent confrontation, is spending more and more time in the house. Before long, she is no longer framed as temporary help. She is living there. She is occupying the role of partner, in the same home where the missing wife's car still sits and her disappearance is supposedly unexplained. Detectives do not need dramatic language to process that, they write it down as conduct inconsistent with a concerned husband in an unresolved case. That detail is not handled as gossip. It is confirmed. Witnesses note seeing the babysitter at the house regularly, integrated into daily life. When questioned, she does not describe a man paralyzed by fear for his missing spouse. Instead, she confirms a relationship that has moved forward quickly in the shadow of an open investigation. For law enforcement, that is a concrete behavioral marker. When someone adopts a new domestic arrangement almost immediately after a spouse vanishes without a trace, it goes into the circumstantial column that, over time, can become powerful. Another piece that stays with investigators is the wedding ring. Early on, they logged that Nancy's ring had been left behind. That alone could signal anger, a statement, or staging. When the babysitter later appears wearing a ring that those close to Nancy recognize, that observation is not brushed off. It becomes one more specific, checkable fact that suggests the missing woman's life is being repurposed rather than searched for. In a nobody case, you rarely get a single knockout blow. You get a string of decisions like this. Throughout this stage, detectives re-interview key players. They look for consistency in Steve Riggins' statements about his marriage, Nancy's state of mind, and his own actions after she failed to return. Any shift in his narrative, times, wording, emphasis, is compared against objective records. Phone logs and work schedules are reviewed to confirm his claimed movements. Investigators keep the scope tight, no wild theories, no jumping ahead to trial-level conclusions. Just a clean separation between documented fact and self-serving explanation. At the same time, the human cost is clear in the background. Nancy's family is still in limbo. They are putting up flyers, asking for updates, holding on to the idea that there might be news. Inside the file, though, the contrast is hard to miss: relatives who do not move on, and a husband who appears to. That contrast is not used to punish someone for how they grieve, it is used to evaluate whether their behavior lines up with the claim that they do not know what happened. Cases like this underscore something important for anyone watching. In suspected domestic crimes, what happens after the incident can be as telling as what happens the night of. Who calls for help? Who joins the search? Who replaces, rather than waits? Being aware of those patterns does not mean accusing without proof. It means refusing to ignore warning signs when someone's safety and memory is on the line. By the end of this stage, the Riggins file is no longer a flat missing person report. It is the record of a woman, Nancy Lee Riggins, gone without a trace in Maryland, a teenager confirmed as involved with her husband, and a series of post-disappearance choices by Paul Stephen Steve Riggins Jr. that align more with starting a new life than fighting to find the person he reported missing. There is still no recovered body, no physical crime scene naming a killer. But the direction of the evidence is no longer neutral. When weeks turn into months and there is still no sign of Nancy Lee Riggins, the case shifts into a different phase. This is where many files go quiet. This one does not. Detectives in Howard County keep the Riggins case open, not as a hopeful missing person story, but as an unresolved problem sitting at the center of their jurisdiction: a mother gone, no physical remains, and a husband whose life choices keep drawing attention back to him. As they push past that first year, investigators accept a hard fact: if Nancy were alive and acting on her own, she would have surfaced somewhere in a verifiable way. There are no paychecks, no official records, no legal footprints. That absence is logged, closed, and set aside as established. They no longer waste time running voluntary disappearance scenarios. Instead, they work the case like a homicide without a body, building a structure from what they can actually prove. One important development is separate from murder, but directly tied to the risk Nancy was about to expose. The teenage babysitter's statements about unlawful sexual conduct with Paul Stephen Steve Riggins are not left in interview notes. Prosecutors act. Steve is charged and later convicted for offenses involving that minor. He goes to prison. On the surface, that conviction belongs to another file. Inside the Nancy case, it is confirmation that what she planned to report was real, chargeable, and serious enough to threaten his freedom, not just his marriage. The investigative benefit is twofold. First, the court record on the abuse locks and key facts under oath: there was a sexual relationship with a minor inside that home. Second, it shows exactly what Nancy was standing up against before she vanished. For detectives who have seen domestic cases escalate, that alignment between motive and timing is not theory. It is leverage. When you are preparing a nobody case, any piece that converts rumor into sworn testimony matters. While Steve serves time on the sex offense, the homicide team does not box the Nancy file and walk away. They revisit witness statements. They examine whether his account of the days around July 1st, 1996, fits with independent records. They study his movements, his employment, and any comments he makes about his missing wife. With each pass, they are not chasing drama, they are testing consistency. A good nobody prosecution demands that every surviving detail has been checked from more than one angle. Behind the paperwork, there is a family still without answers. Nancy's relatives push, ask questions, attend hearings. The investigative team understands that a cold label can be misleading. Cold does not always mean forgotten. In this case, it means waiting for the one piece strong enough to move the file from suspicion to a charge that can stand in court without a recovered body. Detectives know they do not get a second chance. If they go too early and lose, there is no retry. In reality, it is where serious work happens. This is the part where weak cases fade out and strong ones get built brick by brick: confirmed abuse, a missing wife tied to that abuse, a pattern of behavior after her disappearance that never fits the profile of a man desperate for her return. None of it alone is enough to bring a murder indictment. Together, it is getting close. The break in the Nancy Riggins case does not come from a new search, a found item, or a lab result. It comes from inside a Maryland prison, from people with nothing to gain by lying and every reason to be questioned when they talk. By 2000, Paul Stephen Steve Riggins is serving time for the sexual offenses involving the teenage babysitter. The homicide file on Nancy is still open. Detectives have a working theory built on behavior and motive, but no body and no direct admission. Then they get a call. An inmate wants to talk about something Steve said. Experienced investigators do not rush to celebrate when a jailhouse witness appears. These are controlled, careful interviews. The first inmate explains that Steve talked about his wife not as a missing person, but as someone he had taken care of. Another describes Steve bragging that during a confrontation, he put his hands around Nancy's neck. There is mention of her being gone for good, of disposal in a way that would make it almost impossible to find her. The details are crude, not rehearsed, and they point in one direction. This was not a random disappearance. The team does what good detectives are supposed to do. They do not accept a single word at face value. They separate the inmates. They take full statements. They compare them for overlap and for differences. Then they check those statements against the existing record. Did Steve mention timing that matches when Nancy vanished? Did he reference his job and access to waste facilities, which is documented elsewhere? Did he use phrases that line up with what he told others outside prison? Piece by piece, some of those answers land on yes. What makes these interviews important is not just what the inmates claim Steve said, but what they should not have been able to manufacture. They reference circumstances already in the file, but not splashed across nightly news in a way that would be easy to mimic. They echo elements his own circle had hinted at: a violent encounter, a body concealed, confidence that no one would ever find her. It is still circumstantial. It is not a recorded confession on tape. But coming on top of 4 years of silence from Nancy and a confirmed pattern of abuse, it carries weight. The prosecutors reviewing the case understand the risk. A nobody trial that leans heavily on jailhouse testimony is an easy target for a defense attorney. So the question inside the room is not just what did they say, but can we back it up? They look again at Steve's work history, his access points, his shifting statements. They anchor the inmates' stories to independent facts wherever possible, discarding anything that cannot be supported. What survives that process is a core narrative. Steve told multiple people he killed his wife and disposed of her, and key parts of those statements fit what investigators already know. For Nancy's family, this development is not a victory. There is still no body to bring home, no formal murder conviction. But for the first time, the file holds something approaching his own words, filtered through witnesses who can be sworn in and cross-examined. It turns the case from a pattern of suspicion into a chargeable theory. One victim. One suspect. One timeline in Howard County, Maryland, now strong enough to test in court. By late 2000, the file with Nancy Lee Riggins' name on it is no longer just a stack of interviews and missing person reports. It is a structured case: a woman who vanished in 1996, a husband exposed for abusing a teenage babysitter, a rapid shift in his home life after his wife disappeared, and now, statements from fellow inmates that he admitted to killing her. Howard County prosecutors decide it is enough to move. A grand jury indicts Paul Stephen Steve Riggins Jr. for first-degree murder, even though 4 years have passed and there is still no body. The decision is not made lightly. A no-body prosecution is a test of how much weight a justice system is willing to give to patterns, behavior, and words. Here, the pattern is tight. Nancy is gone without a trace. Steve's sexual abuse of the babysitter is proven in court, not rumor. The babysitter's role in his life after Nancy's disappearance is confirmed. His reported jailhouse admissions match details investigators already verified. When prosecutors stand up in court in 2001, they are not asking the jury to guess. They are asking the jury to connect evidence. During trial, the state lays out that chain in clear steps. Jurors hear about Nancy's plans to confront and report Steve's conduct with the underage babysitter. They hear how she vanished immediately after that threat to his freedom. They hear that she left behind her vehicle, her purse, her daughter, and never touched a bank account or government system again. They hear from the babysitter, now supported by prior convictions, that the relationship was real. And they hear from inmates who say Steve described choking his wife and disposing of her so she would never be found. The defense attacks the weakest links, the lack of a body, the reliability of inmates, the possibility that Nancy could have started over somewhere else. But every alternative theory runs into the same problem. There is not a single verified sign of Nancy alive after July 1996. No document, no transaction, no contact. The jury is instructed that circumstantial evidence is still evidence. They are told they must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all imagination. After about 2 weeks of testimony and argument, the case goes to deliberation. It does not stay there long. In July 2001, the jury returns a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Steve Riggins is sentenced to life in prison. For Howard County, it is the first time a murder conviction has been secured without a recovered body. For Nancy's family, it is a legal answer without a place to mourn. The system has finally called what happened to her by its real name, but there is still nothing to bury. Years pass. Appeals are argued and rejected. The conviction stands. Then, in 2007, there is one last development that does not change the story, only confirms it. From behind prison walls, Steve agrees to lead investigators to where he says he left Nancy. He directs them to a wooded area near Hanover, only a few miles from the family home. Searchers move in. Human remains are found. Forensic work identifies them as Nancy Lee Riggins. This is not a new twist. It is the final piece in the same case that began with an empty house and a missing mother. The jury's decision in 2001 is validated by the ground in 2007. One victim. One offender. One timeline, disappearance in 1996, no body conviction in 2001, recovery of her remains later near Hanover, Maryland. For Nancy's daughter and family, the discovery brings something the verdict alone could not, a place to say goodbye. It does not repair what was done, but it ends the extra cruelty of not knowing. For investigators and for anyone who follows true crime in good faith, this case is a reminder of two things that matter. First, that circumstantial evidence, when collected carefully and tested hard, is capable of speaking the truth, even when a body is missing. Second, that when someone inside a home is ready to report abuse or exploitation, their sudden disappearance is never just background drama. It is a warning sign that demands to be treated as potential homicide from day one. After walking through Nancy's case with you, one thing is clear to me: when control, secrecy, and she just left stories collide, we cannot look away. In our communities, we owe each other vigilance, empathy, and the courage to speak up early, before a life is erased in silence. If this case stayed with you, tell me what it sparked, or where you're watching from. If it didn't, tell me why. And if you want more honest, respectful true crime, please subscribe and stay with us for the next story.